Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. You know that feeling when you're driving into the unknown? That tight knot in your stomach that tells you something's off? I felt it the moment we turned off the main road and onto the narrow, winding path that led into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around us, their dark branches twisting above like skeletal hands trying to grab hold. The air felt thick, heavy, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Maybe we should have checked the reviews, Sarah murmured from the passenger seat, her voice strained. She kept glancing nervously out the window, eyes flicking over the forest, almost as if expecting something to leap out at her. This place is giving me the creeps. I wanted to reassure her, to brush it off like I always do, but I couldn't. Something about this place felt wrong, but I couldn't quite place it. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to push the unease aside. The whole point of this trip was to get away from the madness of life, right? Just me and my friends, a cabin in the woods, away from everything. "It's fine," I said, my voice too calm. "It's just remote. That's the whole idea, right? We need to unplug, a weekend of peace." Behind me, Alex leaned forward, his face glowing with excitement in the dim dashboard light. "You're freaking out over nothing, Sarah. It's going to be amazing. No distractions, no noise, just us and the woods." But the deeper we went, the more the weight of the silence pressed down on me. The car's tires crunched over the dirt road, and all I could hear was the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. It wasn't normal. There was no hum of life out here, no birds, no insects, just this suffocating stillness. And then, just as we crested a hill, I saw it. The cabin. It was tucked away in a small clearing, barely visible through the thick trees. Old, weather-worn, and crooked, it looked like it had been here forever. Its wood was gray, sagging under the weight of years. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes staring into the night. And the porch. It barely clung to the cabin's frame, half rotted and leaning as if it might collapse under its own weight at any second. I stopped the car. My hand froze over the ignition. The air felt colder now, almost unnatural. There was something about the way the cabin stood there, as if it had been waiting for us to arrive. My heart began to race in spite of myself. "Here we are," Alex said, grinning as he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door with a creak that seemed too loud for the surrounding quiet. Sarah stayed frozen in her seat, her eyes locked on the cabin. "Are you sure this place is safe?" Her voice cracked, more from suspicion than fear. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "It's fine. It's just old, nothing to worry about." But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't so sure. I could feel the cabin pulling at me, beckoning me in like something alive. The air around it felt thick, as if the trees themselves were holding secrets, whispering something just out of earshot. "Come on, Sarah," Alex called out, walking up the porch steps. "Stop being paranoid, it's just a cabin. We're here to have fun." But Sarah didn't move. Her gaze never left the cabin, her face pale. I could see the doubt in her eyes, but she wasn't about to admit it. Not in front of us. I opened the car door, stepping out into the cold. The ground beneath my feet felt oddly soft, as if the earth were swallowing the weight of my steps. I glanced back at the trees once more. Something shifted in the shadows, a flicker of movement. But when I blinked, it was gone. I forced myself to look away. "Let's get inside," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. I had to stay strong. I had to keep it together. We'd all come here to escape, and I wasn't going to let my own nervousness ruin the weekend. We made our way up to the porch, the wood creaking under our feet, the air colder with every step. The door was slightly ajar, and it opened with a slow, protesting groan, as if it had been waiting for us to come inside. The darkness inside was suffocating, the air stale and thick with the smell of mildew. It was as if the house hadn't been disturbed in years, maybe even longer. I stepped inside, the others following me, their footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty space. The room was shrouded in shadows, the faint glow from the outside barely illuminating the dust-coated furniture. A worn rug lay on the floor, its colors long faded. The fireplace sat cold, a forgotten relic of warmth. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, yellowed with age. The place felt abandoned, as if no one had lived here for a very long time. And then I saw it. Beneath a pile of discarded junk, an old journal lay half-buried on the floor. The leather cover was cracked, stained with something dark and ancient. Without thinking, I picked it up, dusted it off, and opened it. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age. The handwriting was messy, frantic even, scrawled with urgency. I scanned the words. The entries were about a group of people who had stayed here before us. They hadn't just left the cabin, they'd disappeared, gone. The last entry, written in what appeared to be hastier strokes, spoke of whispers coming from the walls, voices in the night, and an entity that fed on fear. I stopped reading, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me. Sarah, noticing the journal in my hands, came over and glanced at it. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "This doesn't feel right, Megan." I closed the journal slowly, trying to ignore the creeping unease that was starting to coil around my heart. It's just an old journal, nothing more. But as the words left my mouth, I could feel the weight of the silence in the room. The walls seemed to press closer, the air growing colder by the second. It wasn't the cabin, it wasn't the place. It was something else. Something was here with us, and it was waiting. It started the moment we arrived at the cabin, though I didn't know it then. I thought it was just nerves. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees that seemed older than time itself. The road had twisted and turned like something straight out of a nightmare, leading us deeper into a part of the forest I'm sure no one had visited in decades. When we pulled up in front of that cabin, I almost wanted to turn around. It looked like it had been forgotten, abandoned to rot under the weight of years. The windows were dark, staring back at us like hollow eyes. The porch was barely standing. But we were here now, and I couldn't back out. It was supposed to be an escape, just me and my friends, away from the world for a weekend. But as I stood there, looking at that cabin, I felt the first prickling of unease crawl up my spine. But of course, I dismissed it. We all did. "Maybe we should have checked the reviews," Sarah muttered, her voice tight as she scanned the cabin. Her eyes darted back and forth between the house and the woods, like she was trying to make sense of something she couldn't quite grasp. I shrugged it off. "It's fine. It's just a cabin in the woods. Perfect place to relax, right?" Alex was already on the porch, his boots thumping loudly against the steps, trying to convince us it was just a little rustic charm. "Come on, guys, let's get inside. You're acting like we're about to summon demons." I forced a smile, though I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. We had no idea what was coming, no idea how wrong this place felt. The door creaked open on its own when Alex pushed it, like it had been waiting for us to arrive. Inside, the smell of mildew and decay hit me like a punch to the chest, The air felt thick, as if the cabin itself had been holding its breath for years. We went inside. At first, everything seemed normal, a little too normal, like a place forgotten by time. The furniture was covered in dust, the fireplace long cold, the windows cracked and fogged. But it was peaceful in a way, the kind of silence you only find deep in the woods, far away from the noise of the world. It wasn't until I found the journal that things really began to change. It was tucked away under some forgotten debris in a corner, its leather cover cracked and stained with age. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle to the touch. The handwriting was frantic, each word more hurried than the last. As I read it, my heart began to pound in my chest. The journal spoke of a group who had stayed in this very cabin before us, and they had disappeared. The last entry was written in a panicked scrawl. "The whispers. They're real. Don't listen. Don't trust the walls." I tried to shake it off. It was an old journal, right? The ramblings of people who had gotten scared of the dark. But even as I closed the book, I could feel a cold weight pressing down on me. Something wasn't right here. Something was watching us. That night, we huddled around the fire, trying to distract ourselves from the growing unease. The wind howled outside, shaking the cabin, but we just laughed it off. The cabin was old. Of course, it was going to make noises. But then, the whispers began. At first, it was faint. So faint I thought I imagined it. A low murmur, like the rustling of leaves, too soft to make out. I told myself it was nothing. But as the night wore on, the sound grew louder, clearer, until it felt like it was right next to us. Sarah looked at me, her face pale. "Megan, do you hear that?" I nodded, though the words caught in my throat. It's probably just the house. Old wood settles. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't. There was something in the air, something alive, something wrong. The whispers were growing, becoming more insistent, like they were trying to claw their way inside my head. "Come closer." My heart skipped a beat. That wasn't the wind. That wasn't just the house settling. I could hear it, clear as day now. Voices, faint and muffled, coming from the walls. They weren't human. They weren't even alive. The very walls of the cabin seemed to be speaking. I looked at Sarah, who was frozen, her face a mask of terror. "It's nothing," I said, though my voice sounded hollow. "It's just the wind." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She stood up, her body rigid, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for the source of the noise. No, it's not," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's coming from the walls. I can't." I got up to stop her, but before I could reach her, she ran toward the door. "I need to get out of here. I can't." "Sarah!" I shouted. But the door slammed shut with a force so strong that the entire room shook. The whispers in the walls grew louder, angrier, as if they had been disturbed. The air turned frigid, colder than it should have been for a night in the woods. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. The cabin groaned under the pressure of something unseen, something that was alive in the very wood. I reached for Sarah, but she was already shaking, her body stiff and trembling. She was clawing at her ears, her face twisted in fear. "Make it stop!" she cried. "I can't hear them anymore. I can't." The whispers had turned into voices now, clear, unmistakable. And they weren't just in the walls anymore. They were in our heads. "Help me! Help me!" I backed away, my pulse racing. The cabin seemed to close in around us, the walls bending as if they were alive. I turned toward Alex, but he wasn't in the room anymore. He had vanished, just disappeared, like the air itself had swallowed him up. The whispers now filled the entire room, swirling around us, crawling under my skin, twisting my thoughts. "It's too late for you. It's too late." I grabbed Sarah by the arm, pulling her toward the door, but she fought me, her eyes wide and frantic. "I can't go back in there," she whispered. "I can't go back. I can't hear them. They're in the walls. They're waiting for us." I tried to calm her, but I knew it was no use. The house was alive. The thing inside it, the thing that fed on fear, on panic, on madness, it had already sunk its claws into our minds. And now it was coming for us. Leave. But the door wouldn't open. We were trapped. And outside, the forest waited, silent, watchful, and hungry. I could feel the weight of it pressing in, feel the darkness closing around us like a noose. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, drowning out everything else, until there was only one thing left. The thing in the walls was going to consume us. I should have known something was wrong from the moment we stepped foot in that cabin. But I didn't. Not at first. The idea had been simple enough. Get away from everything, the noise, the people, the city. Just me and my friends. A weekend in the woods to clear our heads. But the woods are never really as empty as they seem. And neither is a place like this. The cabin looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. Old, crooked, and weather-beaten, like it had been standing there for centuries, waiting for something. Waiting for us. The moment we pulled up, I felt that unease. It crawled up my spine, tight and insistent, but I ignored it. We all did. "Maybe we should have checked the reviews," Sarah muttered as she glanced nervously at the cabin. Her voice was too quiet, her eyes too wide, as though she could already feel the weight of what was to come. I tried to brush it off, the unease building in my chest. "It's fine, just a cabin in the woods, it'll be great." But even as I said it, I didn't believe myself. The trees around us seemed too still, their dark branches twisted like fingers reaching out to catch us. Inside, it was worse. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, dust, and decay. It felt like the cabin had been waiting for us to arrive, watching us. The walls groaned under the weight of silence, and the air tasted stale, as if no one had breathed in this space for years. We moved through it, our footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. That's when I found the journal. It was buried under a pile of forgotten junk in the corner, old and weathered, its leather cover cracked and stained. I dusted it off, curious, but as soon as I opened it, the words on the page froze me in place. The journal belonged to a group of people who had stayed here before us, and they had disappeared. The last entry was scribbled in a frantic scrawl, barely legible. "The whispers? They're real. Don't listen. Don't trust the walls." I tried to dismiss it as the ravings of people who were scared, who had let their imagination get the best of them. But deep down, a cold seed of dread began to root itself in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something more than just an old abandoned house. That night, the whispers started. At first, they were nothing more than a low murmur, barely audible. It could have been the wind, or the house settling. But it wasn't. The voices began to rise, growing clearer, more distinct, until they filled the air around us, slipping through the walls like they had always been there, waiting. I looked at Sarah. She was staring at the walls, her face pale, her lips trembling. "Megan, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, like the air itself was choking me. The whispers weren't just whispers anymore, they were calling to us. I turned to Alex, trying to act like everything was fine. But he wasn't okay. He was sitting on the floor, his face pale, his eyes wide. "It's not the house," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's them. They're here. They're inside." I tried to laugh it off. "It's just the wind. It's just old wood. Let's just get some sleep." But the night stretched on, and the whispers only grew louder, more insistent, until they were impossible to ignore. They filled the space, wrapped around us, scratching at our minds. And then Sarah started to lose it. She stood up suddenly, eyes wide with panic, her breath coming in short gasps. I can't take this anymore. I have to leave, now." I tried to calm her, to grab her arm, but she yanked away, her eyes wild. "They're in the walls, Megan. They're in my head. I can't." Before I could stop her, she ran to the door, desperate to escape. But when she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a violent force, rattling the entire cabin. The noise was deafening, and Sarah screamed, her body shaking as she backed away from the door. "Let me out!" she cried, her voice high and desperate, but the cabin didn't respond. It only grew darker. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, crawling into her mind. I tried to reach her, to pull her back from the brink of madness, but I couldn't. The walls felt alive now, pulsing, breathing. The whispers weren't just in the walls anymore. They were in the air, crawling into my ears, slipping under my skin. They were everywhere, and they were coming for us. I ran toward the door, desperate to escape this nightmare, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabin itself had become a prison, trapping us inside. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. I could feel them wrapping around my thoughts, twisting them, pulling me down into a pit of terror. Leave. It's too late. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. It was like the house was feeding on us, drawing us into its madness, its endless cycle of fear. Alex was gone. I didn't know when, I didn't know how. One moment he was sitting there wide-eyed, and the next he wasn't. The darkness had taken him, the cabin had taken him, and now it was coming for me, coming for Sarah. I turned to her, but she wasn't there anymore. She had collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking violently. "Megan," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We can't escape. It's too late. They're everywhere." And she was right. It was too late. The walls were alive. The house was alive, and it had already won. The whispers filled the room now, drowning out everything. I couldn't hear my own thoughts over the sound of them, over the constant scratching, whispering, clawing. They were inside me, inside my mind. The thing in the walls had taken us all. There was no escape. Not for me. Not for Sarah. Not for anyone. We were part of it now, and we would never leave. From the moment we arrived, I should have known something was wrong. But I didn't. I dismissed it like we all did, brushing off that gnawing sense of unease that crept under my skin as soon as we stepped out of the car. The cabin was old, yes, but that's exactly what we wanted, right? A getaway, a break from the noise. Just us, the trees, and a few days of silence. The kind of silence you can only find when you're far away from everything. The cabin looked like something from an old horror movie. Weathered, crooked, its windows dark and hollow. It seemed like it had been waiting for us, like it had been sitting there for years, just biding its time, watching, waiting for someone to come. Sarah was the first to voice what I had been feeling. "Maybe we should have checked the reviews," she muttered, her eyes scanning the cabin as if looking for a reason to turn back. I waved it off, forcing a smile. "It's fine, it's perfect," I said, though my voice didn't sound as certain as I wanted it to. There was something about the air, something too still, too quiet, that made me want to run. But we were already here. We were going to stay. The cabin was supposed to be our escape from the world. I told myself it was just nerves. But inside, that's when it started. The feeling. The one you can't quite explain. The one that crawls over you like 1,000 invisible hands. We unpacked, set up, tried to shake off the heaviness that hung in the air. But the cabin didn't feel like a place to rest. It felt like something watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every snap of the settling wood sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the house. It was as though something inside it was alive, aware, awake, and it was waiting. That's when I found the journal. It was tucked under a pile of old blankets, its leather cover cracked and peeling. At first, I thought it was just another old relic left behind by someone who didn't care. But as soon as I opened it, I could feel my heart skip a beat. The pages were yellowed, brittle, the handwriting frantic, almost frantic to the point of madness. The journal belonged to a group that had stayed here before us, a group that had vanished without a trace. The last entry, scrawled with urgency, the ink barely dry, said, "The whispers, they're real. Don't listen. The walls, they're alive. Don't trust them." I stopped reading, my breath catching in my throat. The words lingered, like a bad taste in my mouth. It was crazy, right? This was just an old journal, left behind by someone who had gotten scared, who'd let their imagination run wild. But deep down, I felt the cold fingers of dread wrap around my heart. Something was wrong here. Something was watching us. And it wasn't just the house. That night, as we sat around the fire, trying to shake off the unease, that's when it happened. The whispers. At first, it was nothing, just a faint rustling, like the wind. But then it grew louder, closer. Not the wind, not the house settling. This was something else. "Megan," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking, "do you hear that?" I nodded, though I couldn't speak. My mouth went dry, and the walls around us seemed to close in, like the house was breathing with us. The whispers weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices. Low, guttural, the kind of voices that crawl under your skin and make your blood run cold. "Come closer." I tried to laugh it off. "It's just the wind. It's just the house. It's old. Nothing more." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She stood up, her movements jerky, her eyes darting from corner to corner like she was trying to find the source of the sound. No, it's them. They're in the walls. I can't. Her voice cracked, and I saw the fear in her eyes, the terror that had always been hidden beneath her tough exterior. But it wasn't just fear. It was madness, creeping in, taking her. I reached for her, but before I could stop her, she ran to the door, desperate to leave. "I need to get out of here. I can't stay here," she screamed. "It's in the walls. It's in my mind." But as she grabbed the door handle, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire cabin. The walls groaned, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The thing inside the cabin, it was awake now, feeding on our fear. It knew what we were afraid of, and it was using that fear to break us apart. "Sarah, please," I yelled, running to her. But she was already backing away, her face pale and wild. "They're here. It's too late. We can't escape." I reached for her, tried to pull her away from the door, but it was no use. The house was closing in, the air growing thicker, heavier. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were commands. "Leave. It's too late. You can't leave." The door wouldn't open. The windows were sealed shut. There was no escape. Then the real horror started. The walls began to pulse, like they were alive. I could feel it. It was moving, crawling beneath the surface of the cabin, bending the wood, warping the air. The darkness in the corners seemed to shift, to stretch. It wasn't the cabin anymore, it was something else. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, something began to form. An outline, a shape, but not a shape I could comprehend. It flickered, as if it was only half here, half in another world. But it was there. I could feel it. It was inside us. The shadows began to twist, and the air turned ice cold. The temperature dropped like a stone, the warmth of the fire doing nothing to push back the chill that was now in the room. The shadows that had once been static now moved, lived. They stretched across the walls, reaching toward us like long, spindly fingers. It spoke, not in words, but in a voice that cut into my mind like shards of glass. The sound wasn't coming from anywhere. It was everywhere, suffocating, crawling into my head. You shouldn't have come. I could feel it then, deep in my chest. This thing, this entity had been here long before we ever arrived. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. It was feeding. It was hunting. And it had already found us. I turned to Sarah, but her eyes were vacant, her body stiff, as if she had already been claimed. She was no longer herself. She was part of it now. The walls moved again, closing in, and the shadows pressed tighter, pulling at my limbs, at my mind. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The entity was everywhere. The house was no longer a structure. It was a prison, a cage, and we were its prisoners. There was no escape. It was too late. And as the darkness consumed me, I realized something I hadn't known before. The house was the thing inside. It had been waiting for us all along, for someone to come, to feed on, to twist and warp until there was nothing left. And now it had me. It had all of us. There was no way out. There never was. We were part of the cabin now, part of the darkness that had waited so long to claim us. I should have listened. I should have trusted that uneasy feeling the moment we pulled up to the cabin, but I didn't. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But looking back, I can see it now. The cabin had been waiting for us, watching us. The moment we stepped into its rotting walls, we sealed our fate. The place was old, too old, the kind of old that made you wonder if it was even meant to stand this long. The wood was cracked and weathered, the windows blackened by years of neglect. It felt like something out of a nightmare, but I was determined to push the thoughts away. It was supposed to be a getaway, a break from everything. A peaceful weekend with my friends. But it wasn't peaceful. That night, the whispers started. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining it. The kind of sound you hear when you're on the edge of sleep, when the world seems to blur. I thought it was just the house settling, or the wind outside making the walls creak. But as the night wore on, they grew louder. They weren't in my head. They were in the walls. Come closer. I glanced at Sarah, my breath catching. She was already wide-eyed, staring at the walls like she could hear it too. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. "Megan," she whispered, "do you hear that?" I nodded, but my throat felt tight. It was hard to speak. It's nothing. The house is old. It makes noises." But the words felt hollow, even to me. I didn't believe them. The walls were breathing. The whispers were getting louder. I looked at Alex, sitting across from us, his face drawn tight with fear. His eyes were wide, darting around the room, searching the dark corners as if expecting something to jump out. His hand twitched at his side like he wanted to run. But we were trapped. The house, this thing, was already inside us. And that's when it happened. Without warning, Sarah stood, her body jerking as though pulled by some unseen force. I can't stay here," she muttered, her voice low, shaky. She took a step toward the door, but I grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Sarah, no, please, just sit down. It's all in our heads. We need to stick together." But she yanked her arm away, her eyes wild with terror. No, you don't get it," she screamed, her voice cracking. "It's not in our heads. It's in the walls. It's in here with us." Her voice grew higher, more frantic, until it was almost unbearable. She turned toward the door again, and this time she made it. She reached for the handle, but the door wouldn't open. I rushed toward her, but before I could get close enough to stop her, the door slammed shut with a deafening force. The entire cabin shook. Sarah screamed, falling back, hands clutching at the air like she could tear through it. "Let me out! Let me out! Please!" I tried the door, yanking at the handle, but it was useless. There was no escape. The whispers in the walls grew louder, more insistent. "You cannot leave! You cannot leave!" I turned to Sarah, my heart pounding in my chest. Her face had gone blank, her body shaking uncontrollably, as if she were no longer in control of it. "Sarah!" I cried. "Look at me, please! We can get out of this. We just have to stay calm." But her eyes were vacant, staring at nothing, as if she could see something I couldn't. "It knows me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It knows what I'm afraid of. It knows everything." My skin crawled. I wanted to scream, to run, but something inside me, something deep down, told me I couldn't. The thing in the cabin, the house itself, was alive. It had always been alive, and it had been waiting for us. I stumbled backward, my legs weak beneath me, my head spinning with the realization that nothing was as it seemed. The walls weren't just walls. They were breathing, they were watching us. The house wasn't haunted by a spirit or a ghost. It was alive. And we were nothing but food. The whispers weren't warnings. They were commands. The shadows in the corners of the room began to grow longer, stretching toward us like fingers, like claws, reaching to pull us into the darkness. I turned to Alex, but he was gone. Gone. I called out, but my voice cracked. He had been there just moments before, but now there was only silence. I turned in circles looking for him, but the room felt different, warped, like reality itself was bending, shifting. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a thing, a trap, and I was its prey. And then I heard it again. "You are mine now." The voice wasn't in the walls anymore. It was inside my head, my mind, crawling through my thoughts, scratching at my consciousness. The sound was guttural, deep, like the growl of something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for centuries to feed. I ran. I don't know how, but I ran. My feet stumbled across the floor, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the whispers. I reached the door again, my hands trembling as I gripped the handle. It was open now, but the world outside wasn't the world I remembered. I stepped outside. There was no forest, no trees, no sky, just darkness, endless, stretching out in all directions like a void. The cabin had shifted, had pulled me into a place that didn't exist. I looked back, but the door slammed shut behind me. The world, the real world, was gone, and I realized I was never going to leave. I turned around, and the thing from the cabin was there, standing before me. It was no longer just shadows. It was a presence, something twisted and sickly, flickering in and out of existence like a nightmare that could never be fully understood. But I felt it. I felt its hunger, its power. You thought you could escape. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. My body was frozen, trapped in place by something far stronger than fear. It was the house. It was the thing inside it, the thing that fed on us. And then, in the dark, I understood the horrible truth. We had never left. We had always been part of it. The whispers, the shadows, the thing in the walls. They had always been a part of us, waiting for the right moment to consume us, to take us into its endless cycle. We were trapped forever. The cabin had always been waiting for us, and now it would never let us go. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The whispers rose up again, louder this time, and I realized I would never escape, I would never leave. And in that moment I knew I was one of them. Part of the cabin. Part of the endless hunger that would never stop. There was no escape. There never had been. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.